My name is Ergun Caner. I came to this country to be, for lack of a better term, a missionary to you. My father was a muazzin in the mosque, and he was an architect, and so we came to America to build mosques here. I remember that a few years after we came to America, I asked my father about the people that I kept seeing on television. And in every country where I had lived, we'd always been in the majority. I am Sunni. About 90% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni. That includes the Wahhabi, which is a subset, which is what bin Laden is. But I'd never been around Christians. And having never been in a church, I kept seeing these people on television with the, the toupees, the Rolex watches, etc. And I asked my father, I said, Abi, these people, who are they? And my father said this. This is interesting. He said, well, if they are dancing and jumping, these are the Pentecostals. He called them the Pentecostals. He said, if they are playing with the snakes, those are the Baptists. You say, well, that's not us. We're Bible church, or we're whatever, non-denominational denomination. Right. But I'm talking about misconceptions. I'm sure that you have misconceptions about us. I have never worn my laundry on my head. It's called a geffia. No, I never did drive a taxi. I have never worn a silk shirt open to my navel with gold chains dangling in the midst of the chest hairs, and going up to people saying, hello, beautiful woman, come with me. Come on, I'll give you 10 camels for the woman. Come with me. I was a devout Muslim. Didn't wear a dress. It's my geffia. It's my gear. We came to America and quickly identified the community from which we came. Now, I have to tell you this right at the very outset, that Islam is not monolithic. Here's what I mean. There is no one, and I mean no one, not a mosque, not an imam, not the mullah, not the ulema. No one can say they speak for all of Islam. You have the Sunni, Shia, Alawite, Wahhabi, Druze. You have all these subgroups and 12th imams, and you have all these tiny groups within Islam, Sufi included. And they all have different beliefs and different systems, and so you are going to have to get invested relationally with someone before you know what type of Muslim they are. But neither is Christianity monolithic. But we'll get to that. When we settled here in America, I was in the mosque, the equivalent of the PK. We meet on Fridays. The Jews in the synagogue on Saturdays, the Christians on Sundays, but we, Jumu'at prayer, that's the big day. We go to the masjid, that's the mosque. We go to the Islamic center if it doesn't have one. We gather together for prayer. The imam stands closest to Mecca, then all the men, and then 3 feet behind the women. And we begin our prayer, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Walhamdu ala ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You see us putting our foreheads to the ground. During Ramadan, we kiss the Quran and place it to our forehead and put it on the highest shelf in our house, and you wonder, what is all this? That's why we're together. For the first half of my life, until I was almost in college, I lived and died by the 5 pillars of Islam. I was a Surah 5 Muslim. That is, when I say Surah, I'm speaking of the Quran. That's chapter. And Surah 5 of the Quran teaches that take no friends from among the Jews and the Christians, for if you do, you will bring their condemnation upon you. Surah 557. And so I didn't have Christian friends. I had no Jewish friends. It was the mosque, my family, and my friends that were other Muslims. Going from New York, we finally settled in Ohio. Settling in Ohio, there was a strong Islamic community there, and we were very vested in this. The problem is, however, because there was no Islamic schools, I went to public schools. I began to try to explain to my public school friends, in high school, what we were doing. What's the 5 pillars? What is it you Muslims believe? What's the book you carry around? Well, the Quran is 114 chapters. By and large, roughly, the longest chapters to the shortest chapters at the end. But supposedly, on Muhammad's 40th birthday, he had a convulsion, a seizure. At the very beginning of the hadith, that's the recorded sayings of Muhammad, it says that Muhammad rolled on the ground and roared like a lion, foamed at the mouth. And when he comes out of this seizure, he turns to his wife, Khadijah, and he says, Khadijah, what happened? And she said, I don't know. And he said, well, I had a revelation. And he didn't know if it was demonic or divine. And she says, it's from God, from Allah. And so begins Islam. These oral recordings get written down. And the 114 chapters are supposedly every word from Muhammad. It's unlike your Bible, where it says, and then Peter said, and then David said, what you have in the Quran, every word is supposedly from Allah. We read the Quran faithfully. Many of us memorize all of it. And as we study it and as we work through it, we are invested in what is called shahada. That's the creed, the kalima. It is the first pillar of Islam. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his final prophet. Everything else after that, salat, zakat, swan, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, sounds a lot like something that is similar in Christianity. You have fasting during the month of Ramadan. You have giving of 1/40th of your income, 2.5%, which sounds good to some of us. It's a whole lot less than we have to give in our churches. But it's 1/40th of your worth. You have prayer 5 times a day. I would take my prayer rug even to school, high school here in America. And of course, Hajj is the pilgrimage. But all of that you have rehearsed and heard time and time again. May I summarize all of Islam for you? It's based on Surah 23 of the Quran, the 23rd chapter of the Quran, verses 101 and 102. And so that my Muslim friends know that I am not quoting it against the Quran. Let me read to you. And the Quran says, "Then those whose balance of good deeds is heavy, they will attain salvation. But those whose balance is light will be those who have lost their souls. In hell will they abide." Here's the point. At the beginning of your life, from the moment your father whispers the shahada in your ear, and you reach adulthood, you reach what we call our age of accountability, lucidity, whatever you want to call it, you live and die by the scales. Every word and every deed and every motivation and every desire and everything that you do, say, think, or act, everything that you do either goes on the good scales or on the bad scales. So that at the end of your life, if I can say it this way, you have to be 51% righteous to make it into paradise. You have to have more good than bad. This is called the straight path in Islam. Each night our father would put us to bed and he would ask us, tell me the accounting. In Turkish, this is a word play. It basically means, tell me if you did more good than bad. You can immediately see the angst that we're dealing with. And certainly in the context of our culture. You have to lie. You hope you do more good than bad. You hope that you have thought more good than bad. You hope that you have controlled your thoughts, your acts, your deeds, but you're not sure. It's a guessing game. Nothing erases the scales. Temporarily, some things do. A woman giving birth, that erases her scales, but she goes back to scales again. You live and die by scales. As it applies to our culture post 9/11, hear me. Even if there are Muslims who disagree, and I'm sure there are, and may your tribes increase, roughly over 80% of Muslims worldwide will agree with exactly what I'm about to say. Only one thing erases the bad scales. Only one. To die as a martyr in a declared fatwa, in an act of jihad. It explains 9/11. It explains 1993. It explains why Ayatollah Khomeini 30 years ago said that we will not stop till America is an Islamic nation. It explains something, but it also, I hope, opens your heart to my people. Most of us don't act out of rage. We act out of desperation. Those who are getting in the back of trucks and bombing horribly, the Muslims that you live with don't believe this. The Muslims here in America have abdicated. They've made jihad internal, and that is wonderful. There are 2 aspects to jihad. Muhammad said after the Badr, after the battle, he said, your jihad is fighting for holiness. And they have chosen to emphasize that. But worldwide, they believe that by shedding their blood, they will find the one thing that has eluded them their whole lives. Forgiveness. Assurance. Now, I'm going to tell you how I found out that my blood was both insufficient and unnecessary. Do you know what reached me for the gospel of Jesus Christ? It wasn't a huge church or a magnificent choir. It wasn't filling out a card in the back of a pew and leaving it there. It wasn't a guy on television in a suit more expensive than my car, promising to send a Peter and Paul loincloth. Do you know what reached me for the gospel of Jesus Christ? One solitary high school kid who wouldn't shut up. the vitality and the profundity of that moment and of that statement, I hope, sinks into you. This is not a program. This is not another 17 steps to getting Muslims into your church. Reaching my people is hard. It's relational. They tell us that it takes 7 years for the average Muslim to come to faith in Jesus Christ after hearing the gospel. That's because for us, coming to faith in Jesus Christ doesn't just mean that we change what we do on Sundays. It means that our lives, our culture, our foods, we live and die by these rules that dictate to us. Halal and haram, the dietary restrictions. I lived this devoutly. And so you did not eat the shellfish, you did not eat the ham, you did not eat the pork. And so, you do this because this brings honor to Allah. You do this because it's good for your scales. To reach us, you have to befriend us. To reach us, you have to realize that for many of us, faith in Christ means losing our family, our friends, our homes, our jobs, our country, our culture, and some of us, our lives. He wouldn't shut up. There was nothing spectacular about him. He happened to have been a Southern Baptist trying to earn some sort of RA badge or a WANA badge or something. And starting in my sophomore year in high school, he just wouldn't let up. All the way through almost my senior year. Dude, you want to come to this? Dude, you want to come to... He invited me to hot dog hog outs and pizza pig outs and then lock-ins. Dear God. You know what lock-in is, I hope. All those of you watching, I hope you know what a lock-in is. A lock-in, for those who don't know, is the Protestant equivalent to purgatory. You're locked down with kids for like 24 hours and praying for sleep. And I kept saying no to everything. Forever I kept saying no. Finally, to show him, I said, I will go with you, Jerry. I'll go with you. And I went to a church that didn't even exist anymore, Stells Road Baptist Church in Columbus, Ohio. It was near the mosque where I was attending on Broad Street. A little country church that would fit into the size of this studio. A pastor named Clarence Miller who had about a 6th grade education, 1 day of Bible school, sideburns really long, mixed congregation. And that little congregation loved me to the cross of Christ. They didn't mock me. They didn't make fun of my accent. They didn't make fun of the way I spoke or the fact that I didn't know what was going on. I mean, let's be really honest. If you've never been to a Baptist church or one of those Protestant free evangelical churches, I mean, it's confusing. If you've never been to one, it's stand, sit, turn, spin. I didn't know what a bulletin was. I didn't know when I was supposed to turn around, shake a hand. It was like Jesus size. I'm going to have to do left, right, turn, sit. What's the hymnal? I don't know what that is. Every time I did something wrong, they just smiled and put their arm around me. I didn't know what the hymnal was, different from the Bible. I thought it was the Bible because they kept using it more. Some of your people in your churches may think that Bill Gaither is one of the apostles. Those people certainly did. They didn't call me towelhead because I walked into that church in full gear. They didn't call me a sand monkey, camel jockey. They loved me in spite of me. The more caustic I was, the more vituperative I was, the more angry I was, the nicer they were. And the thing is, they just wouldn't let up. After the service, the first service, Jerry dragged me to Pastor Clarence. He said, Pastor, here he is. Like you got to point out the guy wearing the dress, right? He said, here he is. Clarence Miller said, boy, what you think about Jesus? Now, I want you to hear what I said because it's exactly what every Muslim says. Exactly. I said, Isa. That's Arabic for Jesus. Isa. We believe in Isa. Perhaps even more than you. We named the 19th chapter of the Quran after Isa. You know, Surah Maryam, Mary. We believe that Isa was a prophet who came. He was not crucified. Somebody else was crucified for him. We believe that he was a good man, that he was a prophet of Allah, and that he said that he was going to send Muhammad. Surah 61 of the Quran says that Jesus said, I will send a comforter, and this is Muhammad. I respect Isa. That's what I told him. I respect him. Now listen to his response, because it's equally important. He said, boy, you can't respect Jesus. I said, what do you mean? He said, see, Jesus said he was God. No, he did not. The Quran says, do not say Trinity. Desist from saying this. Jesus even himself, speaking from the cradle in the Quran, says that he never said this. He said, what was he crucified for? Well, he wasn't crucified. Surah 4 of the Quran, verse 157, says that Jesus wasn't crucified. He said, but you say somebody else was. I said, yes. He said, why was that person crucified? Well, because of the indictment. What was the indictment? Jesus was crucified, you and I know, historically, for treason from the Romans, but blasphemy from the Jews. And what's blasphemy? Claiming to be God. John chapter 8, clearest statement by Jesus. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Yahweh. The 4 letters of the name of God given in Exodus chapter 3. Jesus, that's why they picked up stones to stone him. Jesus said he was God. In other words, Clarence said, if Jesus said he's God, then you only got 2 options. You either revere him as God or you reject him as a fraud, but you can't simply respect him. You can't give him his props. Guys, at this point, it is vitally important. I'm going to give you every reason for you to pay attention to this simulcast. Because we get so confused. Muslims say we are sons of Ishmael. We are, from Genesis 16, we say that we are sons of Ibrahim. But please remember, Islam is nothing but medieval Mormonism. Think about it. What Joseph Smith did in the 19th century, Muhammad did between 570 and 610. 610 to 622 when he died. What Muhammad did was exactly what Joseph Smith did. Take the parts of the Bible you like, leave the rest. Make Jesus a prophet, not the last prophet, but a prophet who speaks of the last prophet, theirs, either Joseph Smith or Muhammad. Make Jesus speak of their coming prophet. Make the communication by an angel, Jibreel or Moroni. Make heaven work-centered. Deny his godhood. So don't get confused. I looked at him. And then he explained to me that if Jesus was crucified, here's why it happened. That Jesus shed his blood on Calvary's cross so that I wouldn't have to. Now I want you to listen. He said, you don't have to keep trying to atone. One of our leaders, Shabir Ali, the debater, is often famous for saying, before he died, saying, why would one man's death apply to anyone else? We all atone for ourselves. But you see, when Jesus died, according to the Scriptures, was buried, resurrected, ascended into heaven, he did something astonishing. He presented his blood in heaven's altar, and then he sat down. Now, why did he do that? He sat down because he was dizzy? Tired? He sat down because he was done. If Jesus actually died, then his blood counts. He died so that I wouldn't have to. Can I make it as crass as I possibly can? Jesus strapped himself to a cross so that I wouldn't have to strap a bomb to myself. I lasted 4 days under that preaching. I didn't know where the bulletin said I was supposed to wait for the invitation. For those of you who are from non-traditional churches, you don't know that. That's where we sing 784 verses of I Have Decided. I didn't know that I was supposed to wait for that. I stepped out in the middle of the sermon and walked up to Clarence at the front. And he was preaching with his eyes closed, waving his arms. He was one of those guys who said, if you ain't spitting and sweating and slobbering, you ain't preaching. And he's just going nuts. And he opens his eyes, and there's this boy standing in full gear. And he says, what? I said, Isa bin Allah. Jesus is God. I want to be saved. I want to be born again. I want to ask Jesus to apply his blood to my life. He said, could you wait for the end of the invitation? And I said, no. And so he led me to Christ right then and there. Do you get it? No scales. I live by the cross. That's why the Bible says that we preach him and him crucified. That's why we say that we are conformed to his death, as well as the fellowship of his suffering, as well as his power. It's why we realize that that is the central point of all Christianity. Jesus said he's God and Jesus died. If those two things aren't true, this is a waste of time. That night we went to Afterglow. That's where everybody goes to Denny's and IHOP, hangs out. I got to do 2 things as a new believer in Jesus. Number 1, I got to tell the waitress that I was saved. And number 2, I ordered me some ham. I ordered anything they had on the menu. I never had it. It was new to me. That evening, I went, November the 4th, 1982, I went home and told my father, Abi, Isa bin Allah, Jesus is God, I'm saved. It was the last day I saw my father, till he died in 1999. And you may think that's harsh, but in our culture it isn't, and not in Islam either. Those of you who are invested in Voices Martyrs know what I'm speaking of. Hadith, Volume 9 of Al-Bukhari's Hadith, number 57 says, Muhammad speaking, if anybody changes his Islamic religion, kill him. And in over 30 countries around the globe, that's precisely what takes place. You are buried up to your waist in the burial cloth and stoned to death. Or you are just put to death for converting to Jesus Christ as Lord, Savior, and God. Be careful when you speak to my brethren. It's not a simple decision, is it? Now, I became one of those church orphans. Back in the 70s, you guys had these bus ministries. You'll knock on doors, these big nasty buses that had gum just holding them together. You know those little kids you used to bring? The ones who weren't dressed right, who didn't smell good? That was me. One shoe, one sock. Didn't have a Bible. I became those kids who sit in your pews every day, who didn't have mom and dad coming. The church became my family. A year later, both my brothers got saved. Ergun, Erdem, Emir. All three born again, all three Christian, all three converted. Emir teaches at Southeastern Seminary. I teach at Liberty University. We're both in full-time ministry. Erdem, deacon. All because one kid stuck around. Do you understand the importance? This is not going to be a program where you learn the 71 ways to argue with a Muslim. We love to argue. My wife's Southern. I yell, forget 5 minutes later why I yell. She doesn't yell. A Southern woman never yells. She just carries a grudge for like 40 years until there's a body discovered in a well somewhere, chopped up into pieces. But don't get offended when we come up and we start yelling. Come to the bazaars in our country. Come to Istanbul, to our country, where we, come here. For you, 30 lira, 30 lira. That's the way we talk. It may be the gospel according to Jerry Springer, but I'm built for this culture. I'm built for confrontation. So are my brothers. In 1991, my mother was saved. It's harder for a woman in Islam. She signed the nikah, she signed the marriage contract, but now she was a believer in Jesus. No more hijab, no more niqab, no more burqa, no more covering. She was covered by Christ. 1995, my grandmother was saved. My more. Now, I tell you this because all of that is not to say that my whole family is saved. I have dozens of family members, mostly in Turkey and in Beirut, Germany, some here in America. But a significant portion of my family is changed eternally because one young kid stuck around. I don't think Jerry even knew how to spell Quran. He didn't understand the 5 pillars. He didn't know that the Hadith, a collection, looks like an encyclopedia of the sayings of Muhammad. He didn't know what the nature of the 114 chapters was. He didn't understand the 51 best ways to reach my people, or the misconceptions by which we operate. I've given all those to you, and we give these to you, so that you can, have them in the back of your mind. But you see, one of the misconceptions you operate by is, all Muslims hate us. They're all ready to kill us. You know that's not true. There are Muslims who do not believe in jihad as holy war. Sadly, they're not in the majority. And every time one of them rises up in the Middle East who wants peace, they usually get killed by their own, Anwar Sadat's. But they are in the midst of a reformation where they're really going to have to deal with this issue. Surah 256 says there's no compulsion, and then yet 2:191 says there is. 385, 4:101, we go back and forth in the verses. You know what? That will help. But what's more important is for you and I to realize that this is now a different culture. We are in a world that is held hostage by belief. And in my world, We are hungering for someone to take away the scales. We have misconceptions that the people we see on TV, those are the best Christians you got. Because Islam is theocratic, we believe that American culture is the way it is because of the Christians. Because you don't separate the mullahs from the country. We don't separate, they think that America is a Christian nation. You and I know that's not the case, but it is a misconception. Many of them have never had a Christian friend. A Christian who's treated them as an equal. A Christian who's been gracious to them, kind to them, willing to listen. I always tell my friends and my students, I am not about the Christian coffee houses. Those are great and those are wonderful and, holy grounds and Jesus' job and all that stuff's great. I don't go to those places. Usually the only people who go to those places are friends of the owners. I go to the regular coffee houses. I go to where I know I'm going to find my people. I go to the places where the guys have, faces pierced so much they look like they've been hit in the head with a tackle box. It makes me a different type of professor, but there's a number of us that are rising up that are trying to bring us into the new generation of apologetics. Relational, frontline, sometimes confrontational, sometimes polemic, but always unashamed. You have to understand, when we don't hear you as American Christians speak of your faith, when you're talking about anonymous Christianity, seeker Christianity, when we think that you're afraid to give the gospel or to give an invitation, we think it's one of two things. You either don't have the answers to our questions or you don't have the courage to give them. Much of the world is confrontational. Welcome to the new face of America, to the quantum shift in Christian outreach, to the seismic change in the way we do church. If you want your church to look like that bowl of Fruity Pebbles, if you want your church to reach those of us who are not the light-skinned, there's no offense to you. My wife is white. She is so white, she's translucent. She's see-through white. Nothing wrong with that. I'm Turkish. Many of the Muslims who may be watching right now are saying, there's no way he knows Islam. He's a Turk. Because there are Muslims who don't like the Turks. We destroyed the Ottoman Empire. We brought down the Caliphate. That's okay. You can hate me for whatever reason you want. But in this broadcast, you will see the email addresses of the three speakers. And for the Muslims who are sincere seekers, who have honest questions, I don't run from them. We don't shirk from them. And we don't gloss over them. You bring them on. And I encourage your church to do the same. Look the world in the eye and tell them that Jesus Christ is Lord of all, or He's not Lord at all. That He's God or He's nothing. Because if He claimed to be God, He was either nuts, like people walking the streets sucking down woolite, who think they're in Jesus too, think they're God, or He actually was who He said He was. That's the central issue, the core tenets and the absolutes by which we have to operate. Thank you for listening. And they all have different beliefs and different systems, and so you are going to have to get invested relationally with someone before you know what type of Muslim they are. But neither is Christianity monolithic. But we'll get to that. When we settled here in America, I was in the mosque, the equivalent of the PK. We meet on Fridays. The Jews in the synagogue on Saturdays, the Christians on Sundays. But we, Jumu'at prayer, that's the big day. We go to the masjid, that's the mosque. We go to the Islamic center if it doesn't have one. We gather together for prayer. The imam stands closest to Mecca, then all the men, and then 3 feet behind the women. And we begin our prayer, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa hamdu ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. These people, who are they? And my father said this. This is interesting. He said, well, if they are dancing and jumping, these are the Pentecostals. He called them the Pentecostals. He said if they are playing with the snakes, those are the Baptists. You say, well, that's not us. We're Bible church, or we're whatever, non-denominational denomination. Right. But I'm talking about misconceptions. I'm sure that you have misconceptions about us. I have never worn my laundry on my head. It's called a geffia. No, I never did drive a taxi. I have never worn a silk shirt open to my navel with gold chains dangling in the midst of the chest hairs and going up to people saying, hello. You see us putting our foreheads to the ground. During Ramadan, we kiss the Quran and place it to our forehead and put it on the highest shelf in our house, and you wonder, what is all this? That's why we're together. For the first half of my life, until I was almost in college, I lived and died by the 5 pillars of Islam. I was a Surah 5 Muslim. That is, when I say Surah, I'm speaking of the Quran, that's chapter. And Surah 5 of the Quran teaches that take no friends from among the Jews and the Christians, for if you do, you will bring their condemnation upon you. Surah 557. And so I didn't have Christian friends. I had no Jewish friends. It was the mosque, my family, and my name is Ergun Caner. I came to this country to be, for lack of a better term, a missionary to you. My father was a muazzin in the mosque, and he was an architect, and so we came to America to build mosques here. I remember that a few years after we came to America, I asked my father about the people that I kept seeing on television. And in every country where I had lived, we'd always been in the majority. I am Sunni. About 90% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni. That includes the Wahhabi, which is a subset, which is what bin Laden is. But I'd never been around Christians. And having never been in a church, I kept seeing these people on television with the, the toupees, the Rolex watches, etc. And I asked my father, I said, Abi, a beautiful woman, come with me. Come on, I'll give you 10 camels for the woman. Come with me. I was a devout Muslim. Didn't wear a dress. It's my gefia. It's my gear. We came to America and quickly identified the community from which we came. Now, I have to tell you this right at the very outset, that Islam is not monolithic. Here's what I mean. There is no one, and I mean no one, not a mosque, not an imam, not the mullah, not the ulema. No one can say they speak for all of Islam. You have the Sunni, Shia, Alawite, Wahhabi, Druze. You have all these subgroups and 12th Imams, and you have all these tiny groups within Islam, Sufi included.